O gods, if any there be who will listen to my prayer, I do not refuse the dire punishment I have deserved. But lest, surviving, I offend the living, and dying, I offend the dead, drive me from both realms, change me, and refuse me both life and death. Even as she spoke, the earth closed over her legs, roots burst forth from her toes, her blood changed to sap, her arms to long branches, her fingers to twigs, her skin to hard bark. And now the growing tree had closely bound her heavy womb, had buried her breast, and was just covering her neck. But she could not endure the delay, and meeting the rising wood, she sank down and plunged her face in the bark.
Ho-ri-o, 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 ho. Hello, and thank you for joining us once again at the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne, and this time we'll be looking at Ovid's Metamorphoses.
And by the way, the Metamorphoses contain scenes of sexual assault and of people having bodily autonomy taken from them, which I suspect we're going to talk about. But before we get into all that, last time, as we were discussing the Metamorphoses, you mentioned the difficulty you were having in picking a translation for us to work from. Mm-hmm. But I know that several of our listeners really do like to know what translations we're using. So which one are you going with?
Yeah, and before I say something about the translation, I just have a comment which is going to sound really trivial, but I think it kind of captures some of the challenges we face when we're talking about the text. I was just referring to it as the Metamorphoses, and you said the Metamorphoses. And what that signals right away is that you're comfortable reading the Latin text in a way that I'm not, because that's the way you say it, right?
Right.
And so the whole question of how we read the text, whether we read it in its original language, whether we read it in translation, and what translation we prefer and why we prefer it, that's something we could talk about. The one that I've been looking at for the most part, I was looking at actually 3 different ones getting ready for today, but the one I'm mostly going to be paraphrasing or quoting from is one that's in the Loeb edition, which people might have run across. It's kind of a standard classroom edition, an old translation by a guy called Frank Justice Miller. So it's kind of clunky, but it's very literal, and that's what I like about it.
Yeah, the Loeb editions are designed to help students look at the Latin on the facing page and help them figure it out if they're feeling a little rusty, or if there's some specific literary noun that has shown up and you can't remember what the word for woodchuck is or whatever. So it tries to be as literal as possible.
Yeah, and I like that because my Latin's not very good, and so with a text like that where the poetics are so complex, the language is so intricate, that's the way that I can get the most access to what's happening there.
Now, this is a very linguistically playful text. Do you think that in its quest for literalism that it loses even more of the playfulness that is so hard to translate from one language to another?
Well, you put your finger on it, right? We haven't talked a whole lot about translation, but I imagine that's something we'll come back up against again and again as we're talking about different works. Is a translation supposed to be very literal to help you as a reader get closer to the original work, or is it meant to bring that work to you? In other words, on what ground is the meeting taking place? Are you coming to it? Is it coming to you? And translators wrestle with that in all different kinds of ways. One of my very favorite translations is a translation that Barbara Newman did years ago of Hildegard of Bingen's Latin poetry. It's a 12th century woman writer. And what Newman did in translating it was to print the Latin text on the left-hand page, and on the right-hand page, a very literal translation into modern English. And then also next to it, a beautiful lyric that captures the original Latin text in a really powerful and emotional kind of way. So which one is the right translation? Where do you get the closest approximation of the original Latin text? I think of it as being kind of stereoscopic, right? It's with both of those, you get some sense of it. It's in the middle there somewhere.
I think there's a real problem in the desire for the right translation. The beauty of translations is that they offer some sort of insight into a text, and there is no one correct insight to have into a text, right? It's fantastic to have translations to different styles. And as you say, each of these different modes of translation might offer something else. You might have a Loeb translation because you want to look at the text and have a guide for reading the original language, which you are a little rusty in. But you might also want something that captures not necessarily the literal sense of the text, but maybe why it was exciting to the reader, to the translator who is reading it for you. Maybe something that helps you get inspired to continue looking at the text, or maybe just something that feels very relevant to today, even when you're dealing with a text that is very old. So something that maybe takes a few liberties with the literal meaning of the text, but nevertheless gives it that kind of charge that it originally had, or at least makes it relevant to you.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I think people often talk about translations as kind of making the text new, speaking to today's audience, doing something that's for the present moment. I think of the ways in which people were talking about Emily Wilson's wonderful recent translation of the Odyssey as speaking to readers in a very different kind of way, a contemporary way. But that makes it all the more funny, I think, that you and I agreed that one of the translations we like the most isn't a modern translation at all.
No, it's Arthur Golding's 1567 translation in pre-Shakespearean English. And in fact, it is the version of the Metamorphoses that Shakespeare seems to have cribbed from the most, although it looks like he was familiar with other versions. I don't know a heck of a lot about Golding, but he translated quite a number of things in the 16th century. The Metamorphoses is what he's most remembered for now, but it probably wasn't his most popular translation then. But he translated a lot from Latin and French and was very much involved in early Protestantism.
Yeah. And he's probably somebody that very few of our listeners have heard of, but obviously super influential because it's not just directly that his translation had an impact, people reading that translation itself. But like you said, it's the version that Shakespeare uses a lot. So a number of turns of phrase that we think of being quintessentially kind of Shakespeare phrases are coming from Golding.
It's also a very interesting translation because, all right, so a little bit of poetics theory here now. Ovid's Metamorphoses is written in iambic hexameter, which is the traditional Latin and Greek epic meter. Traditionally in English, you use iambic pentameter. That's what Shakespeare used. That's what English seems to have decided as its default poetic meter.
As early as Chaucer.
Golding uses 7-beat iambic lines.
14ers.
They're called 14ers. Yeah, it's a really curious line. It's not anything we're accustomed to reading today in English.
No.
And it just lends it a really interesting, different musicality. It's a sense of what English poetics could have been.
Yeah, and it's in couplets, right? So that means that the last word of each line, like every 2 lines rhyme with one another. And that gives it an interesting kind of feel, an interesting kind of flavor, I think. Let me read a couple lines,
Sure.
Maybe just to hear how it sounds. Is that all right?
That sounds great.
These are lines in Golding that follow along the same passage that we heard in the opening of the program. So here's just a few lines. This is the story of Myrrha, who we might talk about a little bit. The story of Myrrha is a really painful and beautiful story about how the myrrh tree, which has as its sap these very precious droplets that got used as incense and so on, how that tree came to be. And it's extraordinarily beautiful. It's tragic. There's a lot to say about it. But the girl, Myrrha, changes into a tree. And so this is the description of her changing, her metamorphosis in Golding's words. And really, I want to just say something about it for the sound right now. So, the ground did o'ergrow her feet and ankles as she spake, and from her bursten toes went roots, which writhing here and there did fasten so the trunk within the ground she could not steer. Her bones did unto timber turn, whereof the marrow was the pith, and into waterish sap the blood of her did pass. Her arms returned to greater boughs, her fingers into twig, her skin was hardened into bark, and now her belly big the hatching tree had overgrown, and orte in her breast, and hasted for to win her neck, and hide it with the rest. It's a curious rhythm, like you said, those 7 feet lines.
And it's very spacious, which is always the thing when you're translating from one language into another, especially poetry. There's a lot of dense information that you're trying to carry over with you, and making the lines longer allows you to have a little bit more space to breathe as you're trying to put that information in.
And I feel like those couplets are doing something funny too, where the lines, the end of each line rhymes, every 2 lines. If the lines were shorter, it would be sing-songy. It would almost be like children's verse or doggerel, right? Was, pass, twig, big, breast, rest, right? It would be like sing-songy. But because the lines are so capacious, as you're saying, you don't feel that at all. You just feel a sense of return. And this sense of return is very fundamental to what's happening in the Metamorphoses narratively. And I think that's one of the reasons why I like that translation. So, Chris, what do you remember about the Metamorphoses?
So I remember a few things about Ovid, who wrote them. He is writing at the, what do you call that? The turn of the millennium? He's writing, he lives in the late BC's, early AD's.
Yeah,
so
the beginning of the Common Era.
Exactly. And he's a big, important, I guess, noble Roman. And at some point, he pisses off the Emperor Augustus.
Yeah, you should never do that.
Don't. Don't. Not that guy. And he gets sent into exile far, far away in the outskirts of the empire in modern day Turkey, I believe.
Yeah, on the Black Sea. I think I think the place he was is now Albania. I don't even know.
Oh, okay.
It's remote. He's really unhappy.
He's really unhappy. He writes a lot of letters trying to win his favor back, but he doesn't get to ever go home.
No.
I forget whether the Metamorphoses was written while he was in exile.
No, he's written this earlier before he goes into exile. He goes into exile in 8, like the year 8. Sounds ridiculous to say that, but he goes into exile then, and he spends that last decade of his life there in exile, and he keeps writing works to try to get favor, to try to come back, and he never does. But his work lasts, right? So the state of exile didn't cause his work to be suppressed or prohibited or anything like that. So
yes. So this is pre-exile, so I guess we didn't even need to bring that up, but it's a thing that people talk about when they talk about Ovid. So it's a big text. It's written in 15 books. The books are book length. They're about as long as the Iliad's books, I guess.
The structure is super weird. What's your sense of the shape of the narrative? Like if somebody had to say to you, how is it shaped? What is it doing? What does it look like?
So it is telling short stories, and every few hundred lines, it brings in a new short story. Some of them are actually quite short. Some of them go on for much longer. Sometimes you have several obviously linked together stories, and sometimes you have a story that gets linked thematically or through some other doodly-doodly-doo, fading out from one story into another story.
Yeah, they get braided together, right? Sometimes there's a genealogy, like a story follows that's about the descendant of somebody in a story just before. Sometimes a particular thing that's mentioned in a story is the spur for another story. Sometimes we get a story about some people who turn out to be storytellers, so they tell stories. So it's almost like, I want to say a braid or even a more intricate kind of weaving or something like that, where there's all these strands and some of them come back up again at different times.
Now, as an ambitious reader looking at this text, at some point I did start reading it from the beginning, in Latin even. And it starts with, as any ambitious text does, the creation of everything.
Mm-hmm.
That takes a couple hundred lines, and not too many.
Well, he tells it over and over again. Like you get the creation of mankind, and then mankind is really lousy, so they have to get created over again. And then there's the flood, and you have to create them again. It's an experiment that takes several tries to get right.
Yes, and then it goes on, and then you have all these stories and all these different sections, and it's 15 books long. I've not really touched much in the later books, and I know that the ending is
It's
weird.
Super weird. It's super weird. Well, so you have all these stories, as you were saying, in a braided together kind of way, and then it actually moves sort of seamlessly from what we would call myth into history. You get an account of Troy and an account of Rome, the history of Rome, that overlaps in certain ways with the history that we were talking about when we were discussing the Iliad. And then in book 15, a super weird thing happens. He almost returns to that same ground of creation that we had in the beginning, talking about how life comes into being and how things change over time, how everything changes. And that's a kind of an extraordinary part of the work. People don't read it much because it's super weird, but it's incredibly beautiful. I just want to read a couple of lines of it because I think it's kind of remarkable how things change perpetually. He says, "There's nothing in all the world that keeps its form. All things are in a state of flux, and everything is brought into being with a changing nature. Time flows on in constant motion, just like a river." And that kind of language is so beautiful. And he brings it down to the level of individual human beings. So he says, for example, when people get older, he says, time undermines and pulls down the strength of former years. A man grown old weeps when he looks at those arms, which once had been like the arms of Hercules with their firm, massive muscles, and sees them now hanging weak and flabby. Helen, and here he's talking about Helen of Troy, also weeps when she sees her aged wrinkles in the looking glass and asks herself why she should twice have been a lover's prey. "O time, thou great devourer," he says. Anyway, so there's a lot of wonderful things in book 15, but the weirdest part of all is when he starts talking about the transmigration of souls and how it's not just that material things change over time, but souls actually move from body to body. And so there's a weird way in which book 15 kind of goes back over the individual stories we've heard all the way through the Metamorphoses to tell us something about what the stakes of those changes might be.
And of course, many of the stories, or all of the stories perhaps within the text, are about the transformations that occur to various beings, various people, various nymphs, various other creatures, how they are changed with and without their consent, and what the ramifications are of that, and what the drama is inherent in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, always sentient beings, right? Though there are other kinds of metamorphoses too, especially in the beginning, right? In book 1, right? When you have stones that become people, right? You'll have people become stones or plants or animals. But in other places, the metamorphosis goes in the opposite direction.
And this is also, of course, in the language itself, which is very playful. And part of that is the way that words can transform and play around and become other words and become, let's say, echoes of themselves. And so, yeah, he really draws upon this theme within the text, within the language of the text itself, which I always found very interesting.
And you know the Latin text in a way that I don't. Can you talk about a passage where that happens?
Well, let's start looking at some of the stories. I think the easiest passage to talk about that with is the story of Narcissus and Echo.
Yeah. That's a story that I think also a number of our listeners might be familiar with. They might never have read the story in Ovid's version, but they might have heard of it, or they might have seen a painting or something like that that shows the image of Narcissus looking at himself in the pool or in the watery surface.
Yeah, this is also, of course, where we get the term narcissism and echo from. Surprise, surprise. Can you set the scene for us about Narcissus and Echo when they get together?
Yeah, just in a very sort of short version, Narcissus was a very beautiful young man who didn't know, importantly, how beautiful he was because he had never seen himself, right? And in a world without mirrors and without, a way to snap a, picture of yourself, right? How would you know how you look? And so he attracts the attention of a nymph called Echo who falls in love with him. But Echo is being punished for a transgression against one of the gods. She can't speak. All she can do is repeat what she's heard. So when Narcissus catches a glimpse of her, he calls out, and all she can do is repeat his words. So it's a very strange kind of chase that takes place where he can't ever figure out who it is, who's out there. And he's looking for her when he stumbles on his own image in the water.
So when Echo sees Narcissus, and Narcissus gets a little rattled by this and starts crying out, which gives Echo an opportunity to repeat back some of the language that Narcissus has used. So first he cries out, and this is from an English translation, although it's pretty close to what's going on in the Latin. "Who's here?" And Echo says, "Here." And then he says, "Come here." And she says, "Come here." And then he says, it's translated as, "Avoid me not." It's more like, "Why are you fleeing me?" And then she repeats the same text. But then it gets a bit interesting. He says, "Let's get together. Let's come together," which she repeats. But he's doing this language that's just a very simple, "Where are you? I'm looking for you. Will you come here? Let's figure this out." She says these things back in a way that's a bit dirty.
Oh.
The "let's come together" does mean the euphemistic meaning in the Latin as well. At least that's my understanding of it. It's been a little while. I'm a little rusty. But yeah, my sense is that absolutely you can read that as "let's come together." And then they finally run into each other, and she tries to embrace him. And he says, "Take off your hands. You shall not fold your arms around me. Better death than such a one should ever caress me." And she replies, "Caress me." Which is even a bit more suggestive in the Latin. Another translation, "May I die before I give you power over me. I give you power over me." Whoa. That's a better translation. That one's from the Loeb edition.
See, I told you it's pretty good.
Yeah, that's good.
But just parenthetically, one of the things that's so incredibly striking when you say how Echo's words kind of ramp up the erotic charge of what's happening there. We mentioned already that in addition to writing the Metamorphoses, Ovid's also written these works while he's in exile trying to plead his way back. But the other body of work he does is works on love, the art of love, the remedy of love, the Heroides, which are letters written by women who have been wronged in love right before they meet their deaths. So erotic poetry is the thing he does. This is a thing he is known for. And it's not a coincidence that in the Metamorphoses, these erotically charged moments are so powerful. And by erotically charged, I don't just mean scenes where people are in the act of love. Moments like this one, where it's about anticipation and desire and uncertainty. I mean, that erotic charge is something that Ovid does better than anybody else, I think.
Yeah, and this idea of transforming your innocent language into the language of seduction, even if you don't want your language to be transformed that way, gets into the heart of some of the things that Ovid is looking at here.
Yeah. And it happens over and over again in all different kinds of ways. The story of Narcissus and Echo is a remarkable place where that happens. But the story of Myrrha also, the ways in which language both reveals and conceals, it hides and also shows a profound truth. The story, I'm just going to refer back to the story of Myrrha for a moment because I think it kind of illustrates this. She's a girl who conceives an illicit love for her father. and she's horrified. She she knows absolutely that this is wrong, and she hides it completely. She's eaten up inside with shame, and asks herself how she can have this strange desire. And she expresses the confusion and shame and distress she has in terms of language. She uses this language of family ties to express how incredibly confused she is. She says, because he's mine, he is not mine. In my very nearness is my loss. She says to herself, do you realize how many names you are confusing? Will you be the rival of your mother, the mistress of your father? Will you be called the sister of your son, the mother of your brother? So that kind of confusion in language mirrors the confusion in the person's mind. And when she can go on no longer, she prepares to hang herself, and her nurse finds her, and she wants to know what's going on. And Myrrha won't tell her. And then finally she says, oh, mother, so happy in your choice of husband. And she hasn't said exactly what's going on, but it's enough. And the nurse gets goose flesh and her hair rises up and she's horrified, right? So it's a strange moment of communication where something is said and not said. And this kind of thing happens over and over and over again throughout so many of these myths. And Narcissus and Echo is just a super powerful place where it happens.
Another strange moment of communication happens in Io's story, which is another one of my favorites. That happens in book 1. It's early on.
It is early.
Io is a nymph who is the daughter of Inachus, a river.
As one is.
Yeah. And Zeus takes a fancy to her. She tries to resist. He calls up a cloud of fog and rapes her within it. Juno, Zeus's wife, figures out that something's going on. And Zeus thinks he's clever and transforms Io into a cow because
he can hide her with the other cows and no one will ever know.
Exactly.
But she's a really pretty white cow, so she kind of stands out.
Yeah, and Juno isn't fooled at all and asks for the cow as a present, gives the present to one of her guards, Argus, who has 100 eyes. These are just details. But at some point, Argus ties her up to make sure that she doesn't go anywhere, ties her up with a rope like you might with a cow that you're wandering around with. And then at some point, she ends up back by the river that she grew up at, by her father. And she tries desperately to communicate to her father that it's her.
But she can't, right? She can only moo, right? So what can she do?
Exactly. And so the lines go in this less good translation that I was working with from Brooks Moore back in the late 19th century. If only words as well as tears would flow, she might implore his aid and tell her name and all her sad misfortune. But instead, she traced in dust the letters of her name with cloven hoof, and thus her sad estate was known. You have to think about it, right? Because her name is Io. It's just the letter I and the letter O. Mm-hmm. The two easiest letters for a cow to draw in the dirt. And it's this strange moment where it's both very touching and moving. She's finally communicated with her father who she is, and this is perhaps the beginning of some possible redemption or some connection to him. But it's also this strange image of a cow just scraping a line in a circle in the ground. It's very funny and very emotionally wrought at the same time. And I think Ovid is really interested in that combination.
Yeah, being on that threshold between being able to speak and not being able to speak. It comes back to this over and over and over again. You see it in the story of Io, which we might possibly remember when we do our next episode, because we're going to be talking about Christine de Pizan, and she's really interested in the story of Io. So we're going to come back to her. That will be neat. But in other stories as well, like the story of Acteon, who gets changed into a stag. He too, when he's transformed, he tries to speak, but nothing comes out. And there's this really poignant passage that describes what that's like for him.
Well, and then he gets devoured by his hounds.
Yeah. Again, a really useful lesson here. So he's a hunter. He's out there, and he happens when he's out there with his dogs, trying to catch deer. He stumbles across the goddess Diana with her other women in the hunt, and she's bathing, and he stops to watch the goddess. So note to self, never do that. Because she catches a glimpse of him and she raises her hand and scatters water on him. And as the drops touch his skin, he's transformed into a stag. And he's amazed and he tries to speak, but he can't speak. And his friends are trying to look for him and they're calling his name, Acteon, Acteon. He wants to respond. He can't, because he can't produce the words in the same way that Io couldn't. But he is perceived by his own dogs, and his dogs come after him, pursue him, and tear him to pieces. Again, stay away if you see Diana is the lesson.
It's also Ovid being very eloquent about people being unable to speak.
Yeah. He does that again in the story of Philomela. Because they do manage, right? They find a way, right? I mean, Acteon doesn't, but Io does, as you were just saying, and then Philomela too, right? It's not transformation that causes her to be unable to speak, but when her attacker, we could tell the story if we want to keep her quiet about the attack, cuts her tongue out. She can't speak because she's been mutilated, not because she's been transformed. Her transformation comes later, but she finds a way too to get her message out.
So we've described a few of the stories, and we've given a bit of a flavor of what kinds of things happen to people in this text. And one of the tricky things that I've always had when reading this is really thinking about what is connecting all of these things.
I've thought about this for a long time. I first read Ovid Metamorphoses many years ago, like a bajillion years ago, early in graduate school, my first year. And I've gotten a clearer sense of it over time, not just from reading Ovid, but also from reading the many, many, many commentaries on Ovid and versions of Ovid and translations of Ovid that were produced during the Middle Ages. They loved the Metamorphoses. They found it unbelievably interesting, and they used it for all different kinds of purposes. So my sense of it has changed over time, but also I have more and more of a sense of how it was read over time. And one of the things that stands out for me there is the extent to which it's, on the one hand, a story about people and beings changed into stones, to plants, to animals, changing their forms and why that might happen. There are also stories, so many of these stories are also about love, understood in very different ways. Filial love, fraternal love, love you might have for someone you desire sexually, love you might have for someone you desire in a very pure way, right? So a whole range of different kinds of senses. But above all, I think what's going on there is it's an account of everything. It's an account of creation and how nature is organized. And there's things that are insensate, stones, things like this, right? And then there are things that have life but don't move. That's sort of vegetable nature. And things that have life and can move, those are the animals, and then human beings, and then the other kinds of sentient beings, nymphs and so on, that have all the properties that the animals have, but also have the capacity to choose for themselves, to chart out a course in their lives. And then there are the gods. So there's this spectrum that goes all the way up from mud. I mean, that's the word that Ovid uses over and over again to talk about basic material being, right? From the mud all the way up into the most ethereal realm of the divine. And it's that, I think, that's the sort of almost barely visible superstructure of the whole thing. And that's why you start with creation, right? The things emerging out of the mud. And then you end with that really weird book 15 that's about the transmigration of souls and how things come into being. Again, he talks about why you should be a vegetarian and, not eat meat things. You should just eat the things that grow out of the earth. So there's a kind of a circular quality of the text. And as I've read over time, I get more and more of a sense of that, like the creation part of Ovid and how important that is for him.
So as you just mentioned, several of these stories involve people being transformed into animals, into trees, into other plants, into other quote unquote lower life forms.
Uh-huh.
Do you get any sense of what that is suggesting in terms of Ovid's take on other, like trees, on plants, on animals?
Yeah.
Like if you can't, the call to vegetarianism is interesting in a world in which the plant that you're eating may have been a person at one point.
Yeah, no, that's true. Well, one of the things that seems to me so very striking is that, we were saying that throughout the Metamorphoses, it's mostly sentient beings, people, nymphs, whatever, who are changed into stones or plants or animals or whatever. And occasionally we see an account of transformation working in the opposite direction where mud gives rise to creatures in a spontaneous kind of way. Like he says, for example, when the Nile floods its banks, all these creatures, toads and frogs and things like this all come crawling out as if they were generated spontaneously from the mud. And one of the stories he tells in book 1, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, is about how after there was this great flood, there was only one man and one woman left, but the gods told them, took mercy on them and said, well, throw the bones of your mother over your shoulder. And they're puzzled by this for a little while. And then they're like, oh, rocks, right? So they throw rocks over their shoulders, and the ones that the man throws over his shoulder become men, and the stones that the woman throws over her shoulder become women. But the way they're described is really curious. The stones land on the ground, and the more muddy parts of the stones, Ovid says, become flesh, and the harder parts become bone. And the veins that you see in the stones become the veins and arteries. And so it's a very weird kind of organic, very anonymous, almost kind of, I don't want to say monstrous, but like not individual sense that we have of the beings that come into the world in this process from stone to human. Right? By contrast, the vast majority of the stories that are about from human to stone to plant to animal, those feel incredibly vivid and alive. That is, the natural objects we end up with seem imbued with this kind of like sensate nature, this kind of power. So, for example, Niobe, who has tragedies in her life, all her children die before her. She's turned to a stone that's dripping with water, and the dripping water are her tears. And so we get the sense not only of this poignancy, this living rock, but also the sense that every time we see a rock that's dripping with water, we're seeing Niobe. And this happens over and over again. So Narcissus, for example, the narcissus flower, we're seeing him again and again. So that sense of individuality persists, to answer your question, persists in the animal world.
Or when we hear an echo.
Yeah, exactly.
We can give a kind of spirit to it. It gives it a fuller sense of what it might be.
Well, we're hearing her again.
Yeah, and I wonder if that might help modern readers get more of an insight into what it means to have a river be a god.
Mm-hmm.
Where if you can hear an echo and think of Echo and imagine it as a kind of personification, or let's say echo, of the story of Echo, that this happens because of this story, this tale, and it's a reminder of it. Is that how this world gets populated with this kind of animacy, where so many things are connected to these stories of people and other characters, other sentient beings?
Yeah, it's a very different sense of the natural world, I think, from the one that many of us have, where like there's human beings and there's everything else. The world of the Metamorphoses, it seems like the barriers between different states of being are much more porous, or at least you're being invited to think about that.
So on that note, I want to bring up something that you brought up when you were talking about the rock throwers.
Deucalion and Pyrrha.
Yeah, which is to say gender.
Yeah.
Gender and I guess what we would now call sexuality, which both play up in interesting ways throughout the text. There are stories there's a story of Tiresias, who changes gender a few times. There's a story of Hermaphroditus.
Yeah, there are a whole number of stories of this sort. I mean, even the story of Narcissus and Echo, which we were talking about a little while ago, there's a prophecy that's made about Narcissus when he's still young, that he will be happy and have a long life as long as he never knows himself, right? And so what happens, of course, is that he sees his own reflection and he falls in love with it. And so while it's not it's not exactly same-sex desire because it's himself, kind of, there is a strange sense in which we're being invited to think about desire and where it's located and where it might go and how that might play out. So that's one way in which those questions play out. But the other way it plays out, as you were mentioning, is in terms of beings whose nature either changes from male to female or somehow inhabits an in-between space. So Tiresias is a really great example. Tiresias is a seer. He has the power of prophecy. And the reason he has this, Ovid tells us, is because he one day was walking along a path and he saw two snakes copulating, making baby snakes. And he was like, this is in my path, this is gross. So he strikes them with his staff. And that evidently was a bad thing because in that moment, he's transformed into a woman. And so, as one is. Right. And so he goes along for 7 years. And then he's walking along on a path, and he sees, or she sees, I should say, two snakes doing exactly the same thing. And she takes her staff and strikes the two of them. And in that moment is transformed back into a man. And the reason this is told to us is a kind of backstory because there's a debate between the gods. Jupiter and Juno they're arguing about something, as they always are. And they're trying to figure out whether men or women have more pleasure in love, sexual love. And they're like, I know, we'll ask Tiresias, because Tiresias is the one person who will know the answer to this question. And as you can well imagine, how can I put it? When the gods ask you a question, it's invariably going to end badly because somebody will be annoyed with you. And in this particular case, Tiresias gives an answer that makes Juno angry. And so she strikes him blind. But then Jupiter gives him a gift to compensate for it, the gift of prophecy. So that's the reason that backstory gets told. It's kind of cool. But there are others too, like Hermaphroditus, which is a very super weird one. Hermaphroditus seems to have a kind of double nature already. Like the name is like hermaphrodite, right? Because he's the offspring of two gods, Hermes and Aphrodite, right? So Venus and Mercury. But his double nature is only kind of potential. It's not actual in his early life. He's walking along, and a nymph, again, one of these troublesome nymphs, falls in love with him, and she's really attracted to him. And he will have none of it. He's just totally not interested. He's like, get lost. And she's like, no. And she persists, and he still tries to get rid of her. And then finally, she seems to have gone off somewhere else, and he jumps into the water to swim. But she comes after him and holds on to him. And there's this weird passage where she grasps him. A whole series of analogies are used to describe how she's grasping him, like a giant snake or like a sea creature, a whole range of metaphors that are used to describe her. And then finally, they're transformed so that Hermaphroditus and Salmasius become one being, partly female, partly male. And so it's a very strange moment in the Metamorphoses. And then there's others as well that describe this in-between state, or the state of transitioning from one to another.
I also know that there are several stories of male-male couplings in particular in the Metamorphoses. I think there are 7. I was once working on a project of translating a few of them. It had the working title of Man-on-Man Action in Ovid.
Wow.
Yeah, it didn't go very far because after having found them and translated a few of them,
Was it repetitive?
I just couldn't think of anything to do with it, really. But I know that they existed, and I had a list of them. I can't find it right now. Now, I think Narcissus is technically considered one of them.
Well, partly because, I don't know what Ovid was up to with it, but the reception of that myth was very preoccupied with dealing with male same-sex desire. That's the myth that gets used in the Middle Ages when you want to talk about that in an oblique way. So clearly he's being read and understood that way, regardless of exactly where he was going with that myth.
I think that also becomes a myth that's used in some of the 19th century discussions of homosexuality, the inversion myth, the idea that you're being attracted to yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about the ways in which Ovid's Metamorphoses kind of has an afterlife in our own world, I think probably if you had to choose one, the ways in which the myth of Narcissus gets used as a way to ground all kinds of accounts of how sexual desire is grounded and what one's sense of self and sense of the other is, it's been a touchstone for literally thousands of years.
Well, this is a very large and capacious book, and we've had a discussion that has wandered from topic to topic, much like the Metamorphoses itself wanders from story to story.
Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts on how people should go about reading the text? What approach should they take to picking it up?
Well, I think the best way into Ovid is to start, how can I put it? We run across myths of Ovid in different kinds of places, references to Narcissus, an image of Daphne changed into the laurel tree, Niobe, the stone with water on it, weeping for her children. And the best way in is just to find one of these myths. Like if you Google it, you can figure out what the line numbers are, and then you can just pop into a copy of the Metamorphoses and find the story. And just going in for a particular story, and then it will lead you to another one, whether it's one that's in the same book, or you'll just flip around and find another one. They're remarkably vivid, and a number of them have really entered into our, I don't know what to call it, our imaginary, like our frame of reference for ways of talking about moments of extreme pressure or pain. Narcissus is one of these. Another one is Philomela. We mentioned the myth of Philomela transformed into a bird along with her sister Procne. And this is a very powerful myth, and one that I think has a very rich history of reception. There were poetic versions of it translated into different languages in the Middle Ages. People really love the story of Philomela. But in modern times, I think quite a number of women have found the Philomela story a really powerful way of thinking through not only how women can suffer and be victims. Philomela is a victim of rape, but also how women's rage might play out. In other words, I think the reception of the Philomela story, at least for some modern readers, has been partly about suffering and anguish and pain and giving voice to that pain, but also about what next. Because in the Philomela story, people often think about it in terms of what happens to her suffering, her rape, her mutilation, her tongue being cut out. They only sometimes think about the second part of the story, which was where she becomes a weaver, and she weaves purple characters on a white ground and has a messenger secretly take that tapestry to her sister Procne. And the person who's raped and mutilated Philomela is her brother-in-law, the husband of her sister Procne, Tiresias. And when Procne reads this message from her sister on the tapestry, she's horrified and enraged. She's furious. And so the two sisters meet, and Philomela, of course, can't speak. She can only weep. But Procne is full of rage. She says, whatever we can do, we're going to do it. Whether we burn this house down, we're going to do so, whether we kill him, whether we cut off the parts with which he did this crime, she says, we're going to do it. And so the two sisters are together, joyful to be together again, because Procne had believed her sister Philomela was dead, but full of rage, shared rage, and casting about for something to do. And just in that moment, Procne and her husband Tiresias' little son Itis comes in, and Procne looks at him and says, "How like your father you are." It's a wonderful moment. It's a horrible moment, but it's about women's rage. And so many of these myths have that kind of capacity to speak in one way to one generation of readers, but to speak in a very different way to another generation of readers, or to be heard in different ways, perhaps. And I think that the myth of Philomela, it's painful to read. It's alarming. It's awful, as is the story of Myrrha, with which we began, but extraordinarily beautiful language and extraordinarily powerful in terms of how we might unpack them for ourselves here and now.
I also want to say that I've always considered Ovid's Metamorphoses to be a treat that you get for learning Latin. That I like Golding's translation. I've never particularly enjoyed reading it in English, though, but I do really love reading it in Latin. It's not the hardest Latin out there. It's not Virgil hard. It's not, I don't know, Cicero hard. It's really pleasant and really playful, and it does just keep delighting you as you read it. If you're into wordplay and clever uses of language, that's all undercut by some very upsetting subject matter, of course, but nevertheless, it's a real delight. So go learn Latin just for this. So you mentioned earlier the medieval reception of the Metamorphoses and of these myths, and some of the later reception of it, especially in paintings. I wondered if you would tell us a bit more about some of the medieval reception of it.
Well, so the medieval reception, it changes a lot over time. And I think one of the reasons that medieval readers are interested in Ovid is what you just mentioned, the nature of the language, the wordplay, how much you can learn just at the level of language from reading Ovid. And that's one of the ways in which it was received. Some of the commentaries really reflect this. But the other reason they're really interested in Ovid is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the many things he's doing is giving you an account of the world, of all the different states of being. And for medieval people, this is super interesting. So when they're translating and doing commentaries on Ovid, especially in the later Middle Ages, one of the things they're really interested in doing is trying to figure out the kind of natural philosophy or the science of the Metamorphoses. Exactly what it means to be able to speak or not be able to speak. A figure like Io, for example, who is a cow, is an animal, but is able to communicate, like has the power of reason to try to spell out her name, is a kind of a contradiction, right? Animals are understood as not having reason, not having the power of the mind. And so that's one of the things that medieval readers get really fascinated by. How do you sort out these different levels of being? How do we understand that? They're also very interested, at least medieval Christian readers, in using the Metamorphoses as a kind of literal level that we could interpret in figurative language, often in terms of the role of Christ in particular, sort of redemption, right? So it's kind of funny because in the Metamorphoses, the gods are like, I don't want to say bad, but like, they're constantly hitting on human beings, and it always ends badly one way or the other, like, with Io and Juno, figuring out what's going on. It always ends badly one way or the other. And it's striking that for medieval readers, they also are really preoccupied with the role of the divine, but they're retelling the stories in a way that lets them tell a story that fits into their own theological commitments. So that stuff's going on. The other thing that's really interesting about the reception of the Metamorphoses, I think, not so much in the Middle Ages as later on, is the visual art. I think probably a lot of our listeners will have seen some of these kinds of images. For example, there's a very famous statue by Bernini of Daphne changed into the laurel tree. Apollo falls in love again with one of these nymphs. He's chasing after her, and she calls to her father for help as she's running away. And as she's being chased by him, as she's in flight from him, she changes into the tree, and the statue captures her where she's still half woman and half tree. She's in that moment of transformation. That's one of the reasons that's so powerful, I think. And then there's that wonderful, you must have seen it, painting by Caravaggio of Narcissus. It's a really famous image, and haunting. So it's neat to think about, what is it about the Metamorphoses that attracted artists and visual production of this sort? Like, is it just that it's vivid? I mean, a lot of texts are vivid. The Iliad was really vivid, right? What is it about the Metamorphoses that captures people? Is it that emblematic quality that you mentioned earlier, maybe?
I think it's perhaps all of those things, but I also imagine, just thinking about that description of woman half transformed into tree.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting technical challenge and not something you get to paint or draw every day.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of showmanship as to how you can pull this off, how you can make this thing which seems impossible to our everyday life seem real.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, that's a really subtle observation. And you see it in the Bernini statue of Daphne, but you also see it maybe in that Caravaggio painting of Narcissus too, because the technical challenge there, you might think, oh, what's the challenge? You just paint the guy once, looking at himself and then paint him again in the reflection. But what Caravaggio does is he looks different in the reflection, right? So what you're seeing is how he looks to himself. And that is technically really, really kind of marvelous.
And seems like something Caravaggio would be very interested in.
Yeah, you bet.
So that's very interesting, but I really want to pull back to this idea of seeing Christ in the Metamorphoses, because
they work hard to do it. They really do.
It really doesn't seem like he fits here.
Well, you can make it work, right? So there's this one French translation of the Metamorphoses that was super popular in the Middle Ages called the Ovid Moralisé, the moralized Ovid. And what it does is, this is kind of neat thing. It translates the different myths and then expounds the fable. So it gives an allegorical or figurative interpretation of the fable. And so it does it one way, and then it will pause and do it another way. And the introductory line each time that happens is, Exponons la fable autrement. We're going to expound the fable in another way. We'll do it this way. We'll do it this way. We'll do it this way. And the highest level is always that sort of Christ-centered explication. So, for example, the story of Orpheus, which you would think would be really hard to assimilate to the story of Jesus, right? They managed to make that work by alluding to the ways in which Orpheus seeks to bring his wife Eurydice out of the underworld. And they gloss that in terms of Christ saving souls from damnation. I mean, they kind of omit the part where it doesn't work out really well for Orpheus. Right. And they definitely skip over the part where he's torn to pieces by the Maenads. But there's always a way to almost translate the fable in a way that can tell another kind of story.
So are those things that are left out of the story or the moral at the end?
Yeah, to call it a moral, it's a moralization in the sense that it's translating the fable into another register. So certain details will be picked up and others will be ignored. So it's not really a short, pithy little moral of the sort we might be accustomed to, like it's a 1-line or 2-line kind of pithy statement of something that you ought to observe in your own life, but rather a way of telling the story that understands the literal level of the narrative as a kind of covering or a veil that's got a secret meaning underneath. And that secret meaning that the Ovid Moralisé, the moralized Ovid, is unpacking is a Christian theological message, though it's also got other kinds of messages hidden at different levels.
Well, I love how this has brought us back to this issue of translation and what you're looking for in a translation, and the idea of a translation as something that is not just recounting the story or making the language clear in a language that the reader might understand, but is also explicitly guiding you towards an interpretation.
Yeah.
That's something that all translations do, but not necessarily as explicitly as saying, okay, now I'm going to explain what I just told you. But that is an act of translation in itself.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think is useful to have in your mind when you're thinking about what is a translation doing? What am I approaching this translation for?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the interesting features of that French text, that medieval French text I mentioned, the Ovid Moralisé, is it gives you not one explication or translation or moralization. It gives you several. And in doing it several ways over, I think one of the things you're meant to come away with is that there are multiple possibilities. Just that phrase, let's expound the fable this way. Let's expound the fable another way. It gives you a sense of this kind of almost unlimited potentiality. A text can be unpacked in many, many different ways. And this is something that medieval writers and readers were really preoccupied with and really interested by. And it's something that we continue to think about, I think, in our own ways.
So that is the end of our first cluster of episodes, which we've been vaguely calling a cluster of foundational texts.
Well, you have. I keep thinking about them as texts that are all about love one way or the other in very different kinds of ways. I mean, you might argue with me about the Iliad, but I think it is.
No, I feel like when we chose these texts, they were chosen because they're such big canonical texts. But now that we've read them, we've seen through lines. And one of those through lines is very much this idea of love.
Understood in very different ways.
Understood both as a state that you can attain, so to speak, a relationship, but also something that has consequences, positive and negative.
Yeah, so a set of relations between yourself and the world, between yourself and the beloved, a relationship to yourself, even in Narcissus, right? I mean, we've seen this play out in so many different ways, from Hector and Achilles affiliations in the Iliad to the multiple definitions and possibilities of thinking about love in the Symposium, to desire and love and all the states in between in the Metamorphoses, right? So when we say love, it sounds trite and kitschy, right? But it's actually, I think, a way, it's a language for talking about how you understand your place in the world and your connection to other points in the world. But they are foundational texts. I mean, it's true. And I guess I kind of shy away from this foundational word because I don't want it to seem like these are the texts. These are the 3 texts you should read. I absolutely don't think that. But I think is that it's kind of interesting to start with and also to come back to periodically texts that clearly had a very robust afterlife, that were echoed by other writers, that serve as points of reference, points of disagreement, points of emulation, and also that are themselves speaking back to texts before them. We didn't really talk about this so much with the Iliad, but when we were looking at the Symposium, we noticed when there was a reference to Achilles' love for Patroclus, that was clearly recalling the Iliad. And then the Metamorphoses is constantly calling back to a whole series of texts in Greek and Latin that lie behind it. So these are books that are in the middle of other conversations. They're engaging with conversations that came before them and engaging in conversations that come after them. And I think that's why they're good for us to talk about and talk with. I don't want to say foundational, because I feel like, that's like, these are special. And I don't think that's interesting to say about them.
Well, I wanted to bring up the idea of foundational just to problematize it as well, and to think about its relationship to the concept of great books. That there might be great books that haven't had that sense of being foundational, and that there might be foundational texts that just aren't great.
No, that's right. Like, when we were talking about translations of the Metamorphoses, we talked a little bit about Golding. I mean, Golding is not going to be taught. Golding's translation of the Metamorphoses is not going to be taught in a great books, major works class. But he was hugely impactful, right? Both directly and also through Shakespeare. And in some of the works we read later on, I'm thinking especially in our next cluster, one of the ones we've chosen is a writer who's very impactful, but I think you'd have a real hard time putting into a great books course. You'd have to, take a real artist, I think, to make it fly in a course like that.
Well, I'm literally not sure which of the three writers you're thinking of right now.
Well, I'm thinking of Gertrude Stein, because you and I have been batting this back and forth about using her as one of the texts in our next cluster. And she's hugely impactful, hugely influential. In the same way we said that Golding's influence is partly felt through Shakespeare, so too Stein's impact is felt both directly and also through figures like Hemingway, who is reflexively understood as a great writer, right? So that's going to be interesting to figure out, how do we frame that? How do we talk about a writer whose impact is profound and is, I think, good for thinking with? We can say interesting things about and with her, but not a great book in a conventional sense of what you would find in one of those courses.
Well, I think the next cluster that we're doing is, in a sense, challenging the very familiar sense of great books that we've done in these first 3 episodes. We're going to be looking at women writers, which is a category of writer, let's say, that has been habitually excluded from being incorporated into the canon, or at least being incorporated into the canon as fully as they might have been. But even then, the 3 books that we're looking at also are providing other types of challenges to being included in the canon for various reasons.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting set of conversations. We're going to start with Christine de Pizan's City of Ladies, which is canonical and non-canonical. Canonical in the sense that she was very energetically trying to put herself in a canon of literature that included Dante and Boccaccio, among others. But also because when these great books, syllabi, started getting challenged in the 1970s, especially in American universities where this was a thing, when they're like, oh, I guess we have to put in a female writer, Christine de Pizan was often the one that got put in. And that whole question of how a canon works, what we put in, what we leave out, when we want to have a representative of that category, women writers, where do we go? I, on the one hand, am deeply interested in women writers and deeply outraged every time we have to think about that as a category in itself.
Right.
So I expect to have a lot of righteous indignation in our next cluster.
I'm also looking forward to seeing what kinds of themes emerge from these 3 very different texts. If love has emerged as a theme of the Iliad, the Symposium, and the Metamorphoses, what's going to come?
Yeah, well, we've mentioned 2 of the works in our next cluster. So we'll start with Christine de Pizan, we'll end with Gertrude Stein, and the one we're going to do is the middle one, I think is also a kind of adventurous choice, but I think it's going to be really interesting to talk about. Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, a children's book, but also a book that is totally not for children. And that whole question of the extent to which women's writing and women's opportunity to write was understood in terms of writing for children or ostensibly writing to children, that will be a thing that we might talk about. And it's a book that had a long afterlife. It still has an afterlife.
It's a book that I haven't read since I was a child, so I'm really looking forward to returning to it. I have never, I think, thought about it, quote unquote, seriously.
Yeah. Well, again, this question of readers, is gender going to play a role in the ways in which these texts are read? I assume so. That would be a neat thing to talk about. You said you read it as a child.
I did. It was my mother's favorite book. I don't remember whether she gave me a copy or whether there was just one lying around, but I gave it a try when I was 11 or 12 or so. And I finished it, as I recall, and so therefore I must have enjoyed it to some extent. I don't have very strong memories of much of it. I'm curious about going back to it, because sometimes this happens when you revisit a book that you haven't read since you were young.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, that's where that thought technology came from. That's where that idea of how to see the world came from.
Yeah.
When I went back as an adult to finally reread Harriet the Spy,
yeah,
so much of that book deeply informed my understanding of the world.
Oh my God, I love that book.
It's so good.
Did you read the sequel, The Long Secret?
I have read all of her books. They are all fantastic, and I'm sure we will come to Harriet the Spy someday.
Yeah, I hope so. One of the things that definitely is going to be part of the next cluster when we're talking about Christine de Pizan and talking about Little Women is the extent to which these are books about the possibilities that are available for women. And it is not a coincidence that those writers are preoccupied with that. I wonder if Stein is going to care about that at all. She doesn't seem to worry about gender very much.
Well, we will find out. So, in the meantime, if any listeners want to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter at @thespouter. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/3. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts at Megaphonic. Please go to megaphonic.fm and check out all the fancy little shows there. But until next time,
I can't wait to see you again at the Spouter-Inn.